So we're delighted that we have an expert on bees tonight to speak to us, and this is Dr. Jamie Strange. Dr. Strange is a research scientist for the federal government whose laboratory is right here on our campus at USU. And Dr. Strange and his colleagues belong to this lab that we all know affectionately across the campus as the USDA Bee Lab. So what a fantastic job they all have. Every day they come to work and work very hard to learn everything they can about the biology of bees and how they can use these bees, how we can use these bees more effectively as pollinators for so many of our crops. Dr. Strange in particular is an expert on bumblebees. So his lab is especially fun to visit. They always have colonies of bumblebees that they are working with. And they are always studying various kinds of issues associated with trying to make these bumblebees even more effective as pollinators in the greenhouse for crops such as tomatoes. So we have three parts to our evening tonight. First, Dr. Strange will talk to us for about 45 minutes. And then we have a nice opportunity for you to ask questions. We'll take 10 or 15 minutes to do that. And then we'll adjourn from this lecture hall, and we'll go out in the hallways. And those of you who've participated before, you know that as I stand here talking, there are many people out there, so wonderful volunteers who are setting up a whole bunch of presentations and activities for you at booths scattered throughout the hallway. So you can look forward to enjoying that as well after our talk in here. So I want to turn the mic over to Dr. Strange now and hear his very interesting presentation on taking the sting out of bees and making movies about swarm science. So, Jamie.
I want to talk tonight. I'm going to divide this talk into three parts essentially. The first, the night's divided into three parts. The talk goes into three parts. It's symmetrical. So I'm going to talk about this idea of bees in movies, and it's actually a theme that has been repeated over many, many years in many, many films. And I can tell you some of the best films ever made don't involve bees. And some of the worst films ever made do. We're gonna highlight one of the worst tonight. I originally was gonna do a bunch of films, and I thought, I watched The Swarm again this summer leading up to this, and I thought, there's really no need. There's no need to go anywhere else but this movie. Although my daughter Amelia really petitioned for me to tear apart the Bee Movie, I decided I'd stick with this one. And so The Swarm was made in 1978 as a horror film. It's questionable whether it actually hit that goal. There are some scary bits in it. I'll warn you, there's a couple little linked videos here that we're going to show from the movie that may or may not scare little ones. So I will warn you before those play, although I will also tell you that no one actually died in the making of this movie, except for probably some bees. Yeah, I know that's the sad part, right? But we're also going to cover, beyond just this sort of horror movie that's here, we're going to talk about the history of Africanization, how we sort of build up this, oh no, the killer bees are coming, and also the fiction of the biology, so where they got it wrong in the making of this movie. We'll talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to do a little bit on swarm biology and how one might manipulate a swarm of bees to get some of the effects that we see in this movie. So our story begins, here's a map of the world, obviously. In 1956, there was a desire in 1956 by Brazilian beekeepers and the Brazilian government to have honeybees. They had European honeybees at the time that had been brought over from Europe with colonization of the New World. So honeybees were brought over from Europe, which is up here, and they were brought into Brazil and South America, and they established, but they never did quite as well in South America, especially in the tropics, as European bees did in North America in the temperate regions. And in fact, even in southern South America, European honeybees produced much more honey than they did in the tropics. They just weren't well adapted. The Brazilians came to this realization pretty quickly, but it wasn't until the 50s that there was a real concerted effort to go back to the old world and source a population of bees from the old world that were better suited to living in the tropics and producing honey in the tropics. So the young professor who was tasked with this job, his name was Warwick Kerr. He was at Rio Claro University in Brazil at the time, and just brand new faculty. So 2 years into your job, the government says, you're the guy who's going to go to Africa, and you're going to source the right bee for Brazil. And he's like, yeah. Because, of course, this was going to be a great career step, right? And he was a geneticist. He knew a lot about bees, and he was like, this is going to be awesome. So he goes to Africa in 1956 and does a bunch of investigations on the local bees, picks out source populations, tests them for docility, honey production, disease resistance, all these things that we geneticists like to obsess in over bees. He was obsessing about, and he picked great bees, and he stuck them on a ship, and then he flew home. And then that ship arrived in Brazil, and all the bees were dead. So at that point, it was, oh no, this didn't work, so what are you going to do? Well, he says, I got a plan. I'm going to call up the guy who got me those bees originally, and I'll say, why don't you send me a bunch of hives? I'll put those out in an apiary, and I can contain them in that apiary by putting these cool screens on called queen excluders. So the bees, only the workers can get out, the queens and the males can't get out and mate with the local bees. And so he has this great plan, and he calls the guy, and the guy says, yeah, I'll ship you some more bees. But he probably doesn't say it in English. Anyway, he ships Dr. Kerr some more bees. He establishes this apiary. Here the bees come. Okay, they show up in Brazil. You can see it's really nice because latitude-wise, these are pretty close, right? That's not a bad choice. Let's go to South Africa and get bees for Brazil. Gets them established. Things are going great. As the story goes, a visiting beekeeper in 1957 comes and visits the bee yard. And he immediately, as a beekeeper, says, this professor is an idiot. He doesn't know what he's doing. He put the queen excluders on the bottom of the hive. That's going to inhibit honey production. So he, being a nice guy, removes the queen excluders. Within a couple days, before it was realized the queen excluders were gone, 26 swarms were known to have escaped. So these bees swarmed, which is a reproductive trait of bees where they get up and go, leave the nest and establish a new nest out in the wild. So now what we have is we have 26 African swarms that go out. Those swarms almost immediately begin mating with local drones, the local population. They begin hybridizing. These are, remember, subspecies of the same species. And it turns out that these Africanized bees, the mated hybrids, are really, really nasty. And so Dr. Kerr's career was kind of made that day. And actually, it turns out that his career was going to be much longer. He's a member of the National Academy of Science, also the Brazilian National Academy of Science. He's quite highly regarded in the world of genetics. And so he did a lot of things to kind of make up for this small problem he had with the beekeeper removing the things. But essentially, that's the story of how the Africanized bees got here. They began moving north, and what we called the hybrid swarm, because it wasn't just this one little African colony that kept moving forth. It kept hybridizing and moving. And so the genetics of these bees were moving north. The genes were flowing north in this hybrid swarm. And it was a really cool term, hybrid swarm. But of course, some people in the public may have picked this up and said, oh, hybrid swarm's coming, as if it were a big cloud of bees. Well, it wasn't quite. So I just want to give you a quick progression. This is 1957. I didn't do every year here. I just did select years. So 6 years later, the bees have begun expanding. They moved pretty rapidly. Within 10 years, most of Brazil was colonized. By 1977, more than half of South America was colonized. And remember 1977, because this movie is made in 1978. So in 1978, this is about where the bees were, a little further, but not too much more. 1982, they make it through the Isthmus of Panama, and then 85, they're out into southern Mexico. By 1990, they pop into the United States. So 1990, first detection, southern Texas, we have Africanized bees. Panic ensues. You probably, those of you who are alive then, remember everyone running through the streets screaming in terror. Maybe that didn't happen. But certainly they were a problem. They were mostly a problem agriculturally. They're difficult to keep these bees. They caused some death, mostly of livestock and pets. But some people have died from Africanized bee stings. It's a thing. Fortunately, it's not a popular thing to do. The present extent now, it's throughout the Caribbean. Florida's colonized. There's occasional pop-ups in Georgia and Arkansas. Tennessee had a record. But it seems as though the northern advance has kind of stalled out in the last 5 years or so, which is good. We would expect them, being a tropically evolved bee, to hit a northern limit. And this is, interestingly, about where most of the early models on where they would go said they would go. They kind of got there. Some of them said they would go as far as southern Canada, but most people didn't buy that anyway. So this is where they are. And I just want to remind you where they were when this movie was made. So they had a long way to go to hit the United States at this point. But that's not going to stop anybody from making a movie. And so Irwin Allen produced and directed this, and it's sort of classic insects, nature coming to get you, and we're all going to die. What I think is remarkable about this movie is the cast he put together for it, and you're going to see some of that in the trailer that we're going to show. But this is, I can't believe these people showed up in this movie, and I bet now they can't believe it either, those that are still around. So we're going to do this. Hopefully we skip the ad, and I'm not sure if we get sound here. We might.
For more than 20 years, scientists have known that a swarm of killer bees has been headed towards the United States. Now, Warner Brothers presents Irwin Allen's The Swarm.
We have visual contact.
Identify.
A black mass, sir. A moving black mass.
We have been invaded by an enemy far more lethal than any human force.
Starring Michael Caine, Catherine Ross, Richard Widmark, Richard Chamberlain, Olivia de Havilland, Ben Johnson, Lee Grant, Jose Ferrer, Patty Duke Aston, Slim Pickens, Bradford Dillman, Fred McMurray, and Henry Fonda.
Get inside!
A story of courage and sacrifice.
Newman! Go, Brad, go! Move out!
Not since the 30s, when families by the thousands fled the Oklahoma Dust Bowl, has a thriving American community had to be totally evacuated. Until today.
Its size is immeasurable. Its power is limitless. Its enemy is man.
The war that I've always talked about has finally started.
Mile by mile, city by city, it moves, leaving in its wake a path of destruction.
For God's sake, Crane, when are we going to stop this massacre?
Irwin Allen's The Swarm. It is more than speculation. It is a prediction. The swarm is coming.
It is that good. Okay. So let's get back to the presentation, because that's what y'all really want to see. I learned a whole bunch of stuff watching this movie. I've watched it several times this summer. One is that most train cars carry a lot of fuel, so that they blow up really big, and that if you're flying a helicopter and there's a black mass, you should fly into it. That was the take-home message. So there was a lot of other stuff. I like the flamethrowers, which turned out to be really, really effective against bees. They use them. There were just so many bees they couldn't do much. But when you use them inside the building, there turn out to be bad consequences too. So yeah, it was pretty spectacular. So just a quick plot rundown for those that didn't get it there, because they kind of skipped through some stuff. There's a massive swarm of killer bees. Now, killer bees, and in this movie they call them the African bee, even though we know they're Africanized because they're hybrids, that these killer bees have invaded southern United States. And it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that they've done it way ahead of schedule. No one saw this coming except for one guy. This is, for those of you who know this actor, this is Sir Michael Caine. He actually is knighted for his acting. Clearly not in this movie. But yeah, so they put a really cool entomologist in charge, which there's a lot of us, so I'm sure they just picked one. But apparently Dr. Crane has been running around prophesizing the invasion by the killer bees coming any moment. Now let's ignore the fact that they clearly skipped over South and Central America, where they could have killed a whole bunch of people, but instead of doing that, they just came right to, they were going for Houston. Which, you know, if you've been to Houston, maybe that's understandable. But, yeah. So he fails, and in his first attempt to kill the bees, he actually had a couple minor attempts, and then one good one where he was going to dump chemical agents, which I can only assume they mean pesticides, onto the bees, and they have bags. They're flying in the helicopter. Again, you got to have a helicopter, and they're dumping bags of chemical agents out in granules, and then, of course, they're falling on top of the killer bees, who then ignore them, because why would they eat chemical agents? But yeah, they could have used a spray boom with some actual pesticides and killed them, but no, they had to eat it. So General Slater steps in, and General Slater, he's hard-nosed Air Force general, and he's gonna save the day with the flamethrowers. That's when the flamethrowers come in, and then they evacuate Houston, and then the nuclear power plant explodes, and the train runs off the tracks. All this stuff. It's really very exciting. If it happened in about a third of the time, it would be really exciting. But they drag it out for your pleasure. But he fails, of course. And then the entomologist comes, he's still in the movie. He comes back, and of course he's got a girlfriend, and he and his girlfriend, who happens to be a doctor in the Air Force, so the Air Force isn't completely left out of saving the day, they do it together. They get it. Save the day. So in the end, the world survives. A number of people die. All the people on the trains carrying lots of fuel died. We think. They don't really tell us, but we assume they do. So there's going to be another scene, and I just want to show the scene so you can see the one thing I love about this movie, and it's truly the one thing, is that they use a lot of bees, and they actually do a lot of actual bee work, which makes it kind of exciting as an entomologist when you see bees all over a window, or somebody lying on the ground, like acting that they're scared. They may have actually been scared, but knowing that they're not actually getting killed by these bees. And so that's really neat to see bees everywhere in that. So we're going to try this one. Hopefully this link works just as well as the last one. Oh, yeah. So this is the family going out on a picnic. They got their son with them. Dad is too hungry, can't wait. Maybe turn this up a little.
Hey, wait for Paul.
I can't, I'm starving.
So what's cool here is these are actually bees flying there, and they use a lot of that. The shooting out of the log is not real, but there are actually bees there, and these are really good actors. So he's in the car, he's got the windows rolled up, kid's cool. He comes back in, he does a lot of fun stuff in this movie. Okay. There's a lot of, actually if you want to have a really great time, you can go on YouTube and look at all these voiced over clips of the swarm. You should watch it first and then go watch all the, because there's just some really funny people that have watched this movie. You might want to do it before, when your kids are sleeping, because some of them are also inappropriate, but they are pretty hysterical. So that's the one scene I wanted to show. The kid comes back later with his buddies, and there's this great scene, it's actually my favorite scene in the movie, where they get these Molotov cocktails, these bottles full of gasoline with a rag out, and they light them on fire and they throw it at that tree trunk, So he goes back to the place where his parents died like 2 days earlier. And then they're going to kill the bees, and they throw these things. And then the 3 kids run away, and they find these metal garbage cans that say park department on them, and they flip them upside down. They hide under those, and the bees can't get in. The bees get into all sorts of places, like high-rise buildings, but they can't get under 3 garbage cans, which turns out to be the best place to hide from bees. So anyway, typically, though, we're going to switch here from the movie. So now we've got this set up, right? We've got bees. There's this really cool swarming. Hopefully, when you walk away, you're like, now I understand how they did that, how they manipulate bees to do it. So a little bit of biology. What is a swarm? Well, a swarm actually is not a bunch of bees flying across the landscape looking for people to kill. A swarm is typically, it consists of a queen. It has a bunch of drones, which are the males. They're non-worker, reproductive males, and they kind of hang out and eat a lot of honey and don't do much else. But they'll be in swarms. And then several thousand workers. And it can vary. So those people who are beekeepers will know that you can have a swarm that's really small, and you're like, oh, I really don't want that swarm because it's really small, and I'm going to have to take a lot of care of it. And there's some really big ones that can have tens of thousands of bees, and that's the one the beekeepers want, the big ones. And so that's the composition of swarm. When a colony grows, this colony grows inside, so everybody's seen beehives, right? Boxes of bees out in the field or in somebody's backyard. And so you've got that box. As the box fills up, if the box fills up very quickly, there's a lot of bees being produced, typically late in the spring of the year, early summer. They'll begin producing a new queen, because what happens is it gets crowded, and they have a hard time sensing that the queen's there. And I'm going to explain pheromones in a minute and how those work. But suffice it to say, they get crowded in their old home, and they want to split in half and form 2 colonies, because we're big enough to have 2 colonies now. So that's what a swarm is. And then they fly out of their hive, and they land on branches up in trees. Here's a picture. This is actually, there's 3 swarms in this picture that I took one day. I happened to go out to a bee yard, and it had rained for about a week. But apparently it was so right in the middle of the swarming season that 3 of the hives had swarmed and landed on this branch. And so that was pretty neat to see those there. But when the queen that's developing is ready, when she emerges as an adult into her hive, the old queen takes half the colony and they fly away, and they land out here on this branch. And that's a swarm. They'll land out on that branch. They'll stay there for a couple days as they look for a new suitable nesting site. So whether it's a tree trunk or if it's another empty hive, or a beekeeper comes along and catches them and puts them in his hives. But they're looking for a home right here. They're not at all interested in you, in this swarming thing. It's very cool, though. When they fly in mass. They form sort of a big cloud moving across the landscape. It's very impressive. It can be a little terrifying unless you know that they're not going to bug you. And if you know they're not going to bug you, and you truly know that in your heart of hearts, not like some of you might think, they're not going to bug me, and then you still run away. But yeah, they're pretty non-aggressive at this point. This non-aggression is sort of regulated, and this whole orientation is regulated by these things called pheromones. Pheromones are chemicals that an individual produces, and often a blend of chemicals that an individual produces, that change the behavior or physiology of other individuals. The queen herself, in a colony, produces this suite of chemicals from her mandibular glands. Her mandibles are her jaws, right? She produces out of these glands, like we salivate, we have saliva, but the queen makes this really cool stuff, way cooler than what we make, called queen mandibular pheromone. And it's this blend of chemicals, and that is what essentially, that blend of chemicals keeps peace in the hive. So it keeps the other bees calm. When queen mandibular pheromone is present in a hive, the bees don't try to make new queens, they don't try to do other things. She makes a whole bunch of other pheromones too that also play into this. But for the simplicity of this, that queen mandibular pheromone is the signal to the other bees that the queen is present. And they use that in the swarm to orient. So if they smell that queen mandibular pheromone, and they sense it, I say smell, but sense it with their antennae. If they sense that queen mandibular pheromone, they'll gather around it. They want to go to that. If the queen moves in flight, if she's flying away, they will follow the scent of that. They don't follow it quickly. It doesn't move at 50 miles an hour. But a swarm will move a couple miles an hour, and as long as she keeps flying, they'll keep flying around her. As soon as she lands, they will land and they will form a ball around her, like the one you saw in that tree. So how do you get something like this, where the principal of the school is so terrified because there's bees all over the window and there's people who died outside, and she's very sad, as she ought to be. But this is the cool part, is that they've got bees running up and down this window. So, and then you've got this, where you've got the two parents out there who refuse to wait for their son to eat lunch, and this is what happens. And so you have this huge swarm of bees flying around. There's bees everywhere, and of course they're doing this and this and this. And we think, standing here, oh, this is terrible. These poor people are getting attacked by bees. But it's really just a trick of the camera, right? We make the swarm in front of them. We put the camera here. They're behind the swarm. We're shooting through the swarm, and they're doing this, even though there's no bees around them. And these bees really could care less if they're there, because what are they doing? They're looking for their queen. So in order to do all this, and this is where we're going to get into like the how. So right after this, you can all go out and make your own horror movie. So that's where we're going with this. So we shot some videos this last week in my yard. So if you're a neighbor of mine, sorry. Was a little loud, and we didn't actually scream. But I wanted to show step by step kind of how you do this. The first step is that you have to take a queen from a colony. So we go into one of the hives in the backyard, and we catch a queen, and we put her in a little plastic cage. And this is blurry because it's the first still, but we're going to play this, and it'll all become clear, sort of. And you put her in a cage, and then you put her somewhere. And that's what we're doing here. So you can see, if you look at this, that there's a little dark thing running up and down. That's the queen. She's in there, and she's running back and forth. Okay, so we've established there's a queen. And you have to believe that that's actually a queen. And then what you need to do is you need to give that queen some bees, because they're all in the hive, and they're like, our queen just disappeared. Some giant came in, ripped the lid off of this hive, and took mom. That's weird. But I did it so fast, they didn't know I did it. But so then you need to take the bees and throw them out so that so essentially kick them out of the hive. So what I did was I grabbed this thing in my hands. You're going to see here, it's called a frame. It's a frame of bees. The bees, it's where all the comb and the larvae and stuff are. And they're on that. And I'm going to take it over and I'm going to shake it off. And I put bees there. And then you see this little sort of cross I built that she's hanging from the top of that. And I've already shaken, obviously, a bunch of frames right there. So you can see that I'm going to do it one more time. You can see where all the bees are on the ground. So, a couple thousand bees. You can see them all flying around me right there, right? And they're like, where's mom? That's all they care about at that point. So we did this, the whole like tearing a hive apart and shaking bees. I think that, one of you youngsters should ask me how many times I got stung at the end of this. Just going to say that, okay? So here they are. Shake them on the ground. You're like, well, are they going to find mom? And in fact, they do. You see them all climbing up here. This is so awesome. So they're just going up and up and up and up and up. Yeah. And they could care less that we're standing there. Yeah. So there they go. They're finding their mom. And eventually they form the swarm. This is actually a picture of the exact same swarm that we took about 20 minutes after we had shaken them all out. So then they're all gathered, and inside of there is that queen cage. She's in the middle. And they're like, we got to hang out with mom, because mom says it's time to swarm, and she knows. So let's see if we can. This may be the one that we had the disaster with. So okay, so essentially what this is showing, and so everyone close your eyes. No. We took that same picture and the same swarm, rather, and followed it until it got nice and big. And this was just to show you that it had rounded out, and you could see sort of the frenetic movement of the bees as they're settling in on her. And then, once you do that, a day after the swarm is made, so you make the swarm and you walk away, because right then they're still kind of like, wait, our house, we live that's why are we out here? They're not sure what's going on. So they're still kind of a little defensive, a little protective, but overall pretty calm. So you've got the swarm made, and this is when you call the actors and you say, okay, we're ready to shoot the film, come on over, when you're doing your horror film next year. And I expect credit. So the day after the swarm, the bees have settled in, they're non-aggressive, and this is what we're gonna do. So this is me, I'm taking the queen out, carefully reach into that thing of bees, pull them out. This is the queen in the cage, so I've got the little cage by a string here. It's important to remember to attach a string. And I'm gonna shake them onto the ground so you can see where the queen is. There we go. Okay, and so there's the queen cage. We've now got the queen, she's separate, and And there she goes. So now you get to play. Now you get to shake the bees in slow-mo off of your bee cross. Yeah. I watched this about 50 times today. Do it again. Yeah. So they all shake off, and they just fall to the ground, which is really nice. And then some fly up in the air. But remember, they're not that they're thinking, but their instinct at this point is to find the queen, relocate on the queen. Our swarm has been violated. The queen took off, or that big guy who ripped our house apart yesterday took the queen again. We don't know why, but he took her somewhere, and we should go find her. So they're off to find her. Here's what happens. We actually shot a lot of video on this one to show as the bees are right there. I'm standing right next to it, right back and forth, are gathering now on my hand because I'm holding the queen cage right here. And they're starting to fly up. They're beginning to realize that she's no longer on this cross, but there's still some pheromone there, so they're checking it out. But as they quickly realize, oh no, there's that dude, he's got her. And then they like to fly up your shirt and up your sleeve, so that's not fun. So roll up the sleeve so they don't get up there. And they're landed. You see the one on my ear back there? That's fun. They're really, if you ever want a really good tickle on the back of your head, do this, because you get like 15 or 20 bees crawling around, and it's exciting. So they're gathering, and the swarm's getting bigger. And so you can see now, this is another shot of my hand, and I want to show here as we slow down, right about here. You see these little white dots on the bee's butt, their abdomen? There's some little white ones. You can see them. You see those little white dots, and they're fanning their wings and doing this. And what that little white dot is that's their Nasanov gland. So the Nasanov gland is on the back of a bee, and they'll begin fanning once they find the spot. They find the spot where the queen is. They land, and they immediately start doing this. And they're sending off another pheromone, another signal, Nasanov pheromone, that says, this is home. This is where we need to be. Okay? So all the other bees are sensing this with their antennae, and they're like, cool. So they fly there. And so pretty soon, that little cross empties itself of bees, and they're all on my hand. And in fact, if you sit for a while, they'll begin landing on your arm and crawling up and doing all these things. But you sit there for a few minutes, and they all form a nice tight ball around your head. They're actually great for the winter bee gloves. It's difficult to ski, but otherwise not too bad. But they will gather around in a nice tight ball, and they form that. And so that Nasanov gland sort of takes over, because of course the queen's inside, they can't really get to her mandibular pheromone very quickly. It's not getting in the air as much. So now the workers take over and they say this is home. It's also what they use to signal the entrance to a hive to other bees. They'll fan their Nasanov pheromone. So here's just a picture as it gathered. The queen again, the queen is right here under this. And there she is with her swarm. So the deception, of course, is that as a filmmaker, the bees go where the queen goes. You, as the person who's manipulating them, can move her around. And as you walk across a field slowly, 20,000 bees follow you. And they're non-aggressive, so you can do that. And like I said, you can put the actors on one side of the swarm as you walk, and the camera on the other side, and shoot through it. And those actors go, and it looks like they're being attacked by bees, when in fact, the bees aren't actually very close to them. The other thing that's really interesting is I can stand there with a hand covered with a couple thousand bees, and the reason I can do it is because they rarely sting when they're in swarm mode. Why do bees sting you? They sting you because they're defending something. Defending their honey, they're defending their little, the brood, their little sisters that are in the nest. They're defending a home that they don't want the bear to rip apart, right? So they're not really in a defensive mode when you have them in swarm mode because they don't have any resources to defend. So in order to get them to sting you in swarm mode, you actually have to squash them to get them to sting you. So again, you can also do things like put the actor behind the glass, have all the bees on the other side where you rub all this queen mandibular pheromone. Incidentally, you can buy it, it's commercially made as well, a synthetic. So if you want to like punk your neighbors, go get yourself some queen mandibular pheromone, put it on their door handles. I'm giving away all my secrets now, so I better shut up. But yeah, so queen mandibular pheromone is a good little trick there. But yeah, you can put it on things, the bees will gather on it, especially if you shake all the bees out and you don't give them a queen, then they immediately go where the queen mandibular pheromone is. The other fun thing is that you can, if you don't want the bees to land on something, you can put DEET on it. So you get some off and you spray off on yourself. The bees will not land there. It's not only a mosquito repellent, but bees don't like to land on it either. They find it disagreeable. So it's used in a lot of these scenes, maybe not in this movie, but in more modern movies, to keep bees out of people's eyes or their ears or their nose. It used to be you'd stick cotton up your nose to keep the bees out of it, but that kind of shows up in film sometimes. So what you can do instead is just rub the DEET around and they stay off of that. And then the queen mandibular pheromone, of course, can be placed on all sorts of things like windows or objects in the environment, like in that scene where the mom and the dad get stung, the mom falls down. There's a great still from this movie they took of the mom covered with bees, but it's so clearly a mannequin that you're like, wow, yeah, she became very, very pale very quickly, and looks like she's made of plastic. But yeah, so they have this great still from that film where she's covered with bees, and probably what they did was just smear some queen mandibular pheromone on her, and then shake a bunch of bees, and there it is. You have what looks like a person covered with bees. This is all, these are actually the two guys in this movie who are responsible for that deception, the cinematographic, deception that you saw. This is Norm Gary. He was a professor at UC Davis, and he did a whole bunch of these swarm manipulations for movies. He consulted on a ton of different movies over the years, and he was sort of famous for this. He also was the guy who set up the world record for bee beard, the heaviest bee beard, which was like 100 and some pounds. He had this guy, and they built this wooden frame, and the guy put his arms and stuff on a frame, and they made this big suit, and they just shook bees. The guy was covered with queen mandibular pheromone, but it's like a 100-pound bee beard or something. Guinness Book of World Records. That's weird. But here he's playing his clarinet while he's got a bee suit on. And then this is Irwin here, the producer, Irwin Allen, and he's standing on the outside of that window where I think the principal is on the inside going. And here he is on the outside with all the bees, showing that, again, this is sort of the behind the scenes, you can manipulate bees thing. And so these were the two that really perpetrated this movie on us, and we have to thank for it. So now just a really quick run through on the criticism, because I felt as I was reading more and more about this movie, and it kept popping up on 10 worst movies ever made lists. And I can't disagree with that statement, although I've begun to appreciate it more. That it really took a lot of liberties with biology, with history, with all sorts of things. Again, according to this, while it was amazing the rate at which Africanized bees were moving from Brazil northward, at about 300 miles a year was the average up until about 1990. They were actually kind of cooking along there. That's an amazing distance for insects to move. And yet, because they were in the tropics and they could go year-round, they could continually swarm and continually move. And if the swarm's moving 10 or 15 kilometers, it can cover a lot of distance pretty quickly. Yet this movie was still made 12 years before bees ever arrived. So it certainly did gin up some panic ahead of time that maybe didn't need to be there. It also maybe gave the bees some bad press. There is, by the way, at the end of the movie, a disclaimer that says, these killer bees are nothing like the industrious European bees we have here pollinating our crops, which I'm sure really allayed all the fears they had built up. So again, honeybee swarms are this form of reproduction, and they're not in that sort of attack mode, but more of a, we need to find better resources or have another home. And that's what it is. So they don't really care about you and me when they're doing this. It's really about them finding a new place to live. The other interesting thing was the first 30 minutes of this movie or so is devoted to them wandering around a military base that has all these dead people, dead military guys in it, and they can't figure out why. But anybody who knows anything about honeybees knows that honeybees leave a stinger when they sting, and none of these poor victims had any stingers in them. So they may have based the entire movie on the wrong thing. It wasn't until the helicopter flies into the dark cloud that they realize they're bees. So yeah, that was a bit odd. The other interesting thing is the potency of the sting with these bees was so much more than it is with actual bees. It was something like, one bee could kill a person. If you got a single sting, you were going to die. And then you hallucinated before you died. And the hallucination, I see Amber up there nodding her head like this is the best part. There's so many best parts of this movie. Was this enormous bee. It was like a 4-foot tall bee in front of you going, and just buzzing at, and then people, and they'd scream and then die of cardiac arrest or something, who knows. So this movie, again, it's about 2 hours and 20 minutes, 2.5 hours. That's a lot of time to sit through it. So I could maybe compress it, would have been good, but the acting's terrible. It's, a star-studded list of people who just clearly phoned it in for a check. And again, it's not actually that scary. There's probably a few scenes where people are going to, but certainly by today's standards, this is pretty tame. So I read one review online a couple weeks ago. The guy was saying, I loved this movie as a kid. I remember going when I was 4 years old when my dad took me to see this, and we watch it every year. I was like, wow, that's kind of child abuse, but I'm glad you had that relationship. So I would consider this, it's rated PG, so if you want to indulge yourselves later, we can. It's not too bad. It's also obvious at points where they're not using real people or real bees. The scene where the bees are coming out of that tree trunk, I think they're probably dumping sand or something in and blowing it out. It looked kind of not bee-like to me. I've never seen bees move quite that fast, unless being shot out of a cannon. So I want to thank a number of people. I got credits instead of acknowledgments today. So my daughter Amelia did a lot of the video footage that was really stable. I know you were like, wow, how'd she hold her hands so still? We're going to buy a tripod, incidentally. My wife Ellen Klinger, who also did a bunch of the shooting of film, and I want to thank Nancy and the Ecology Center for inviting me to give this talk. I really appreciate the opportunity. And then again, the bees in my backyard for putting up with all the stuff I did to them. So with that, I'll take any questions you might have.
Well, I think Dr. Strange would be very happy to answer any questions if anyone has a question for him. There's a question there.
Oh, yeah. There you go. So the day we shook him out, we took the queen out of the hive and shook him out onto the little post. I got one sting, and you can see it in the video the next day because it was a little red spot on my arm. But I didn't point that out because I wanted that to be a mystery. The second day with all this stuff, none. I had them. They were all over the place, and I didn't get any stings. So very, very docile. There was a question right there. You had one. Yeah, they do. Actually, Africanized bees produce honey. Currently, the thinking is that that in the tropics, that they're not going to get rid of Africanized bees. So there are a lot of programs, one in Brazil, where they've made a lot of progress on selection of the Africanized bees for docility in commercial operations. So they've actually been doing a lot of, it's interesting, bees, we breed bees all the time in this country. We have a pretty large industry devoted toward producing desirable traits in bees. Docility, honey production, disease resistance, all these things, like we do with cattle and stuff. And so beekeepers know this, and they know that you can go buy certain strains of bees that produce a lot of honey or are really mellow. And so yeah, in Brazil they're doing the same thing. They're doing that, and they're selecting for honey production. They're selecting for bees that don't swarm and fly off and leave your hive empty. Not swarm like kill people, but swarm as in take off and leave you with no bees. So yeah, they are used throughout the tropics, actually, quite frequently. There's somebody up there, green jacket. Can we have a relay on that question? Do I have an EpiPen? No, I don't. I'm not allergic. So we have some at the lab. We keep EpiPens out there. So. Somewhere back there. I know there's one over here. Oh, there. Striped shirt. That's a great question. The question was, is a bumblebee or a honeybee bigger? So I'm going to tell you that depends, because a queen bumblebee is really big, right? If you see them, they're like that big. But worker bumblebees can actually be really, really tiny. But in general, honeybees are smaller than bumblebees. Yeah.
What kind of bees do you have?
What kind of honeybees do I have? Yeah. These are Italian. They're kind of probably mutts, really. So honeybees were brought over to the New World by colonists, and they were from different regions. So the first ones that came in were what are they called? The black bee of Northern Europe. They're this dark little honeybee that came from mostly probably England, Spain, France, the countries that colonized. And then later on in the 1800s, there was a real effort because those bees were sort of known to be kind of nasty, and they didn't produce as much honey as these ones from Italy or Central Europe, called the Carniolan bees. And so there was an effort by the US government to go source bees in the late 1800s from Europe, from these populations, and bring them over. And so those were introduced, some government ventures, some private ventures, and we got new bees. And so the predominant ones sold in the US right now are the Carniolan and the Italian. But they're all Apis mellifera, the honeybee. They're hybrids. We call them Italian. They're probably about as Italian as me. I'm not very Italian. So, but yeah, it's quite an industry, this bee breeding. Danny. So, North America has a really rich bee fauna. We have, obviously, there are a lot of bumblebees that are native to North America. There are a lot of solitary bees. Most bees in the world are solitary. They don't live in hives. They live in little holes in the ground. You think of things like sweat bees. Everybody knows what sweat bee is. Little tiny, often shiny metallic bees. So we have thousands, in fact, about 4,000 native species of bee in North America. Our lab studies a lot of those. We study ones that are mostly agriculturally important, but we also have a fair insect collection that we keep on campus of bees, where we look to see what's what. And then, of course, in the tropics, there were a lot of, they're what they call the stingless bees. So these are also colonial bees, and they make honey, usually in smaller amounts than the European honeybee does. And they form relatively smaller nests as well. But those are really important tropical bees, a group of bees that, and interestingly, they're stingless because they lack a stinger, but they will bite you. So, so don't take them for granted. How many bees do I have? Is that Olivia? I should put my glasses on. That's a good question. I have about, I'm going to say 90,000 right now. 90,000 bees, individuals. No, I have 3 hives that I have at my house, and then we have a bunch for the lab that we have around the valley. Not millions, but tens. So over there, and then we'll come back here.
The global decline in bee populations that the press has been making a big deal of recently, is that as big of a thing as they're making it out to be?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. So most of you are probably familiar with this idea of colony collapse disorder, and I'm going to answer this in the honeybee world and not in the native bee world, and I'll do that because it's different with every species of bee. So some species are doing fine, others are not doing fine. But the honeybee itself is actually, the last 3 or 4 years in the United States, we've seen an uptick in the number of domesticated colonies that are being kept. There's a lot of, certainly since the mid-2000s, a lot of interest by backyard beekeepers and a lot of commercial beekeepers, increasing numbers. So we've actually seen a bump the last 2 or 3 years. Now, saying that, we still have very high winter losses. Bees typically die when it's cold. It's unusual to lose a colony of bees in the middle of the summer unless you get a really bad disease. So what happens is they die over the winter. And those losses are they range anywhere sort of in the last 10 years from about 20% to about 30, 35%. we had a couple really good years, and then this last winter, 15, 16, we saw a bump again in mortality to about, I want to say it was around 30% again. So yeah, we still battle these declines, but people have gotten much better at managing for the decline, understanding that that's coming, taking care of the really healthy colonies, splitting them, making extra ones, and this kind of thing. So again, there's a lot of manipulations we can do. So yeah, it is something we should be concerned about. The press, as you probably know, it's an election year, so right, we know how the press is good at blowing things out of proportion. And they do that with pretty much everything, including bees. And so we've seen these sensational stories, and you know, the sort of, my favorite is always this quote that they give by Einstein, that if all the bees disappeared, we'd all starve in 5 years. You know, Einstein, first of all, never said that, and second of all, it's just not true. You know, we'd still be eating wheat and potatoes. So yeah, while that would make certainly life less interesting food-wise, it does have a tendency to get blown out of proportion. So we had a couple questions here, and then, yeah, go ahead.
So what's the biological difference between the queen and the female worker bees?
Wow. Yeah, so that's, so the question was, what's the biological difference between the queen and the worker bees? And how does the colony choose a new queen? Okay, so I'm going to give a real short answer on this because it's you could probably do a whole course on it. But really quickly, the honeybee colony is a social organism, and the queen is the reproductive female in that. So she's the one who's mated. She's mated with the males. She's laying the eggs. All the workers in there are her daughter, and they're sterile, so they don't lay fertilized eggs. They can ultimately lay eggs, but there's another interesting behavior where the other worker bees will actually eat their sister's eggs, but not their mother's. So they police if one of their sisters tries to lay eggs. But yeah, the females are the sterile working caste, the workers are the sterile working caste, and the queen is the reproductive. There are actual differences in size and in physiology and all sorts of stuff to go with that. The choosing of a new queen, again, there's been a number of studies that have sort of looked at how do they pick the right one. But what they do is they'll take a number of the eggs that are recently laid if they lose their queen. So if I go in and steal the queen out and walk away for too long, they'll begin to make a new queen, and they'll actually begin to make multiple new queens. And so they had the one slide where I showed with the queen cells on it, and there were multiple queen cells, and what they'll do is they'll make a bunch of those, and the first one out essentially gets to be the winner. And she goes around and she'll, typically what she does is sting all the other queen cells and kill the queen inside of it that hasn't yet hatched out. However, if two of them come out at about the same time, they actually will eventually find each other and fight. And so you'll have a fight to the death there, and one of them will get to take over. So what they do is they choose a bunch of a bunch of eggs that will become queens. They feed them a lot, and then somebody makes it and somebody doesn't. Yeah, oh yeah, and you had a question.
So what if you were a movie producer, what scenario would you do with things that swarm?
If I were a movie producer, I'd just make documentaries. Yeah, it's not. I don't know. I'm sure there's some good stories out there. I'd probably stay out of the horror. You know, one of my favorite B movies is this one, Yuli's Gold, which is, you know, it's what my kids would call boring. But it's looking at this guy who's a beekeeper, and he, you know, how he gets through life working with his bees and stuff, and you learn more, and it's a less sensational story. But the problem is I can't watch these and not be critical about all the goofiness in it. So, yeah. When did I start doing science on bees? That's a good question. Let's see. I started in 1990. Well, I did my first work on bees in 1993. I took a class as an undergraduate in college, a beekeeping class, because where I went to school we had a beekeeping class, and I took it because I was like, that sounds cool. And I did not realize how cool it was until I opened up the hive of bees, and I went, whoa, I know what I'm doing. So yeah, that was, so 1994. Yeah.
How many species of bees
Worldwide, about over 20,000. We don't have a really firm number, but it's over 20,000 now. Over there, little guy. How many bees do we have in the lab? Oh, how many hives? So we have, for our honeybees, we have right now, I think, I'm going to say about 10, because we have, and then we actually have 2 different projects. My project has about 10 honeybee colonies, and there's another project with about 20-some, but we also have, and you're going to see out there a couple of them, I think JD brought a few, some bumblebee colonies, and we had, I'd say about 30 bumblebee colonies at the middle of the summer or so, maybe more, I'm not sure. We had a lot. So we have a lot of bees that we keep in different kinds. Yeah? Do they always get their stinger stuck in you when they sting you? Honeybees do. Well, honeybees have a barbed stinger, so they have a little hook on it like a fish hook, and when it goes in, they pull away from you, and that stinger pulls out, and the venom sacs are attached to the stinger, and what's really cool is even though the bee flies away, the sacs, the muscles keep contracting, and it keeps pumping venom into you. So if you get stung by a honeybee, and you see a little white and black thing sticking there, scrape it off as quickly as you can, get it off, and that will reduce the amount of venom that you take into your body. So honeybees almost always do that. There are some exceptions. Sometimes they'll get a little sting and it won't stick. Typically, they don't inject much venom if that happens. It's just a little poke, and they'll fly away. People who've kept bees for a while be like, oh, it kind of got grazed, it didn't really get me. And so that's what that is. But bumblebees don't have barbed stingers, so they don't leave it in you. They can sting you multiple times. Yellow jackets, while they're not bees, they can sting you multiple times as well. So most stinging insects can sting you multiply, but honeybees can't. They get you once, except for the queen. She doesn't have a barbed stinger. See, there's always an exception. Yeah, one more question up there, and then I think we're... Oh, so after they sting you? So after they sting, they actually fly away, and it rips the stinger out of their body. And then they essentially leak their blood, their hemolymph leaks out of them, and they die. So there was one more right up in front of. We can do it. That was a quick one. Yeah.
My question was, what can we do to help honeybees?
What can we do to help honeybees? Well, I can tell you this, that what you can do, not just to help honeybees, but to help all bees, because they're all important as pollinators, there are multiple things. One, the first and foremost is planting habitat, and by that I mean flowers. Flowers that begin blooming early in the season, plant an array of flowers. It's like, when they talk about your plate, multiple colors make you healthier. Same thing, lots of flowers, lots of colors. You want a long bloom season, begin in the spring, go to the fall. Things that you see bees on. So if you can plant some things like these really fancy doubled roses and things, and the bees never go in them, but more open flowers where they can get to the pollen and the nectar. Those are what you want to do. So planting a lot, avoiding spraying pesticides, especially on blooming plants. Obviously, sometimes, I got some lovely bushes that the weevils love to eat. And if you don't control the weevils, they won't bloom. So, but they don't, so you might have to treat something to get rid of a pest, but don't do it when the bees are present. And certainly try to even avoid the season when the bees are on them. So those would be the big things. Often habitat improvement. So you can you can get one of these little, you can actually keep bees. You could have honeybees if you wanted to, or you could get a blue orchard bee nest thing, which is a group of straws that you can hang in a tree, and the bees will come nest in that. And so all those sort of things are good to help increase bee health in general. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.